Restorying the Culture is hosted by Tanya Taylor, Rubins Steam Story mentor, and Camille Adair, family constellation facilitator. In this podcast, these long-term friends explore how stories serve our lives. Their inquiry meanders into the realms of science, theater, health, and consciousness, moving the individual and global narratives forward as they draw upon their relationship as the laboratory for their experiments in truth. So many of us feel isolated and alone in our deepest longings. Each one of us is necessary in rediscovering the truth of our human story and listening to what is calling us forward so that we can restory the culture together.
Hi, welcome to Restoring the Culture with Camille and Tanya. And today we'll be talking about restoring friendship from our 2 decades plus friendship with each other. And I'd like to start this episode with a quote from David Whyte. "Friendship not only helps us see ourselves through another's eyes, but can be sustained over the years only with someone who has repeatedly forgiven us for our trespasses, as we must find it in ourselves to forgive them in turn. Without tolerance and mercy, all friendships die." Welcome, and I'd love to know what you think about that, Tanya.
Oh, well, that's such a profound quote, isn't it? There's so much there. There's so much there. What comes up for me is, one, the deep truth of it, right? To have to forgive each other over and over in small ways and big ways. And what also comes up for me is what conditions create the motivation or the inspiration to do that? Like for myself, when has it been worth it for me to really make that big a commitment, right? Because that's a tremendous commitment. It's a spiritual commitment. It's like a marriage commitment to have that kind of commitment in a friendship. And how do we get there? And sharing about our stories. How have I gotten there? How have you gotten there? There's just so much there, isn't there?
Well, there is, and one thing I keep thinking about is that it takes a certain kind of, for me anyway, to do that, an internal condition of my own sovereignty to be able to hold that kind of space for another person. Like, in other words, I have to feel a certain amount of wholeness within myself so that I can pull back projections and I can have tolerance and mercy and not pathologize or not allow a friend to make mistakes or have their own stuff. And I think that's, I've been thinking a lot about this in terms of, for me in my own life, friendships that I have with men and women. And it's not just in my life, but I've heard other women talk about this too, that I think women have a tendency to go really deep and bond in relationship, but I think we have a harder time often allowing for space and sovereignty between each other. And that can kind of get in the way, that it's actually one of the wounds of how we're I think what we're trying to do in bringing the feminine and developing the feminine more is bringing in also those internal sovereignty boundaries that allow us to be okay with someone else, even when we're not okay or when they're not okay, that we know where we stop and where another one starts.
Right. And obviously, the codependency or the enmeshment model. And when there's not a space to speak into disagreement or dissonance, where it's not a big enough container, I think that's one huge issue that blows up female friendships. But I'm also thinking about this morning, I saw something that Glenn and Doyle wrote on Instagram about also in patriarchy, how we've been conditioned to turn on each other rather than turn on the toxic conditions. So I think that happens a lot in female friendships, right? You and I have talked so much about this competitiveness. Is it okay for me to be big and you to be big? Is it okay for me to really genuinely celebrate your wins without feeling threatened about my own? There's so much to navigate.
Well, there isn't, but and everything you're saying really is like the sort of the sign of a mature adult who owns their own space in life, in their life, right? And sometimes I kind of feel like we have been wounded so much, I think, in our lives, in our friendships, that there's maybe a part of us that stops growing in that way and kind of has a tendency to go into this like this uber boundaried place of protection, which is understandable because sometimes the wounding between women actually can really be trauma inducing, and then we carry that for our lives. Like, I sometimes feel like even older women still carry some of that energy of like, oh, this is my BFF. It's almost like we can be seduced into the old Hallmark model of what it means to have a girlfriend.
Totally.
Like it's like some superficial feel-good thing when it couldn't be further from the truth if you're really in it as two whole people. It's completely rewarding, but it takes work, and it also calls us into our authenticity and into being able to hold suffering with another person.
Yeah, and to learn to do that when most of us, anyway, and this is cultural as well as personal, carry so many wounds from our own mothers, as most of our mothers carried wounds from our grandmothers. And I think for me, and I really do want us to get personal about our friendship to share, because I think it's easy for people to project on us and go, wow, look at them. They have this amazing long-term relationship. Like, I'd like to know the real backstory of Oprah and Gail's long-term relationship, because I think you and I have had as many ups. We've had a lot of ups and downs and spaces in between, a lot of different manifestations. And coming in, carrying the wounding of our mothers, and then hoping to have, I think, a BFF, right? Who's a quote unquote perfect mother, or substitutes for the mother we didn't have, or the sister we didn't have, or what our past wounds. It's a lot to navigate, and I'd love to hear from you. I don't know if I've ever asked you this. I mean, we've never even really had this exact conversation before, and then I'm happy to share what it's been like for me. What has it been like? What have been the hardest parts, maybe in the best parts of navigating our very depth-based, complex friendship for the last 20 years?
Thanks for asking, Tanya. Jeez. You can tell that we don't script these podcasts. God.
Well,
one thing I love about you is that you have a tendency to go for the jugular, and I have to admit, I kind of admire that about you. I mean, I feel like with you, I know where I stand, and that's one thing I admire, for better, for worse. And sometimes knowing where I have stood in your life has been painful. I think you and I also, even though there's a lot that people might look at us and think that we're so much alike, there's a lot of ways in which we're different. And I think that's difficult for women to navigate. I think you and I have had a lot of opposition stuff come up. And how do we hold the tension of opposites? We've had this conversation before, which is that, you have had a tendency, you're an introvert, but you're very extroverted, I think, in the way that you deal with situations, right? And I think I've had a tendency to internalize a lot of things and try and navigate in a quieter way, but from an observational standpoint. And I think that's been hard for us in the past, you know. I mean, you and I I remember when we had a break almost 20 years ago for a while, and it was actually very calm in the beginning, but we just sort of said, it was like, I want to do this, and this is what I need. And you said, well, that's not okay with me. And I said, okay, but I need to hold on to what I need. And you said, I need to hold on to what I need. And we kind of walked our separate ways for a while.
Right.
And that was painful. And there was some stuff that happened around that was, I'm sure, hard for both of us. But I think the thing I want to emphasize is that there are very few people, not that our friendship hasn't been honestly one of the most challenging for me at times, as a marriage could be, right? It has been for me.
Yeah.
But it's like you keep coming back and being willing to stay in the game. And I think that to me is what's so profound about our friendship. It's not that you and I have that we don't have a lot of complexity and that we haven't had dissonance and that we haven't judged each other and that we haven't hurt each other. But like you are willing to step in when many other people wouldn't be willing to step in and say, hey, let's go another round. And I think that's where you and I match up.
Yeah,
because
definitely.
I'm always someone who's like, you want to stay in? And that's why I have so many long-term friendships.
Yeah.
Because if somebody's willing to be relational with me and lean into the opposition, I'll stay in a relationship.
Yeah, totally. You will. And I will too. I do think that, and that's the thing that we don't control in a friendship, a deep friendship, a real intimate friendship, or in a marriage. Sometimes I think the reason people go their separate ways is more than anything, somebody's just not willing or able for whatever reason to stay in it. And of course, sometimes it's not appropriate to stay in it. So what makes it appropriate for us to make the choice to stay in it? That's almost like opening up a whole other inquiry, isn't it?
It is. Well, I mean, for me, it's somebody who's been willing to like own their part in a dynamic, which I think you and I both have done. I mean, we've opened up really hurt places and for me, the reason I was willing and able to step back in it and have another round is like, I mean, you really owned your part in it. And I feel like, I don't know if you feel like I owned my part in this last one or not.
I don't think...
You could speak to that.
Yeah, I could. I mean, can I speak to the last round? Because
Sure.
I think it was the hardest and most profound, and it brought me the closest to you. And I just want to sort of say, from my point of view, I grew up as an only child without siblings. And I think that in and of itself can make it hard to, being an only child, to learn to share power and be intimate with a peer, because you're in relationship. I was always in relationship with adults. And I just want to say there's something historical about that that I don't even quite understand. I just know it's come into play. And also I was a very lonely child and longing for intimacy I didn't get. So I think I come in with a lot of those heavy expectations on female friendships. And I have wanted that sort of old school BFF. And yet I get it more that there's a myth to that. And the more I've embraced sort of the myth of like the illusion, it's like what Prince Charming is to men, BFFs are to female friendship, right?
That's right. Mm-hmm.
It's a lie. So the myth of friendship, getting past the myth and the facade of who we should be to each other versus allowing who and what we really are, like that was my own internal process. And I think you got battered by me a bit because of that projection. I had it with two other friends who, are no longer friends of mine, but they were willing to step more into the role. And in the end, I didn't want the role. I wanted the authenticity. And I also, and that's what you provided. So when we had a split, which was only like a year ago, and went our separate ways for a while, I mean, I feel like it was sort of like when an addict has to hit bottom. I was kind of in a different relationship with a different friend. And I mean, this sounds like lovers, and it's not, but it felt passionate like that. It felt like I had to choose between you and this other woman. And what she was sort of offering me the illusion. And there you were, like I really do feel like the sister you've always been to me there is a sisterhood between us and a depth. And when I came out of that kind of bottoming out with the illusion of that, you said something that really, really changed my entire way of relating to you. And it changed my feeling about you. And you might not even know this, but we were sitting in a little cafe in Santa Fe, close to our house, in the very back of the restaurant, having dinner and talking about all of this. And what you said to me was, you said, no matter if we never do business together again, no matter if we never make any money together, because part of our relationship has also been partnering professionally, and we've had to navigate dual roles. You said, no matter what, if nothing ever happens again, I just want you to know I love you, and I pick our friendship first. And for me, that completely, I started sobbing, I think. At least I sobbed inside. Maybe you just saw a tear or two run down my cheek. But for me, women have always wanted things from me in my life. And I'm a manifester. I definitely sort of am somebody who I make magic happen. I can own that. I make opportunities happen for people. But there's something about, in my own childhood, having to jump through hoops, perform, make sure people got goodies that I brought with them. There was a sense for me of always proving myself and not being loved unconditionally, being loved in friendships for what I can do for people. And you were so sincere and so earnest that I think it took me about 19 years in our friendship to feel loved by you. And in that moment, I felt loved, and everything else went away. And I was completely committed to you and our friendship. Like, I let go of all that had blocked me from really having intimacy with you.
Wow, thank you for sharing that. I'm so touched and also just amazed at the courage and for where you're willing to go with your vulnerability and transparency, which is partly why this friendship really works for me, because I'm someone who is so drawn to the truth, and the truth is not always pleasant. And I just, I love being able to go to these places with you, and I'm so grateful that you were able to articulate that and that we're making this public. It's kind of blowing my mind, but
and that's the difference between you and me, because I don't even feel anything about making that public, but you push me behind the scenes, I think, in ways that are deep and profound. And that's where my discomfort is. It's in the private and in the intimate spaces. And would you say that sometimes I push you maybe in the public spaces?
Would I say it? I would say that's an understatement. I feel like I get flung out into the atmosphere. But it's good. I was talking with a mutual friend earlier today about this podcast, and I was telling him that, I have so much happening in my inner world, and and the things that I'm learning and pursuing and developing, engaging in that are also fruitful for me. And the harder part for me is to take things out into the world, even though I've done that a lot through documentary filmmaking. But I've always done it as the person behind the camera, or the interviewer. Grant's been behind the camera, but I've been the one across doing the interview and really tending the content and knowing that that movie, that message lives inside of me, and that's going to come out in this very intimate, specific way, which is why, when we did all of the editing we did on our movies, it was like the editing process was just this incredible experience for me because it was so specific. The message needed to be so specific. But that's a different way of putting yourself out there because you're putting someone else's wisdom out there in a way.
Right.
And even when I had my first podcast, my podcast, it was in 30 countries and it was on death and dying. And it was called A Lifelong Practice. And it was in the early podcast days. It was on iTunes. And but I was still interviewing other people as the experts. And so for me, the big way that you're calling me out is not that I'm an expert, but that I am being public in who Camille is and what Camille thinks, not just about how interested I am in other people, but how can I be interested in myself? And that's really a good thing for me.
Yeah. And I mean, I think it's so of this moment, isn't it? Like, we're still in the pandemic. We're still under quarantine. We're doing this podcast in New Mexico. And I look around and I'm like, look at the so-called experts around us, the so-called, nobody freaking knows. And being with the mystery, it doesn't mean we don't have expertise in our areas. It just means to me, on some profound level, the guru age is over. And I remember when my grandfather died. I was 14 years old, and he had been the director of finance at NIH, National Institute of Health. So when he got diagnosed with a brain tumor, he was taken, into their very best program, the experimental program. And my grandfather, who was the person I admired the most in the world, he'd gotten his PhD at Columbia, and he had all these big jobs all over the world, in Lebanon and Pakistan, and then in the DC area. He put his faith in doctors and in education. And my family puts a lot of faith in graduate degrees. And I didn't even finish college. I dropped out of acting school 3 different times. But there was something for me that it was a disillusionment because he died at NIH, and he died a very painful death. And I walked in his room one day when he was just wailing, and then he died hooked up to all of those machines in a coma, and he came out briefly and was just begging to be unplugged. And what happened for me in that disillusionment at that young age was I went, okay, the experts, these here are the best doctors, the best medical stuff available in the country. All these PhDs and MDs, and my grandfather's made this choice, and he has a PhD, and all of those quote unquote things that we mark as authority in our culture. And he died, and he didn't have a good death. And there was a kind of shattering around inside of me around what's an expert. And I think it pushed me even deeper onto a kind of path, which is my nature, to question everything. So when you talk about that, I go, to me, the greatest gift you can give is Camille. And I trust you and your life experience on such a deep level, and feel like people get so much from that. Not that there's not a place for talking about expertise or systemic change or anything in any kind of systems. But to me, at this moment, there's something radical about us just being who we are and letting that be an offering and it may resonate and it may not for people, but to me, what comes out of your soul is so inspiring when you're just you. And I love that. And I imagine that others hearing you love that too.
Oh, well, thank you. Yeah, I mean, it's, I think a lot of this goes back to ancestral stuff for me. I think that this is an ancestral imprint, the thing about, I've talked, I think, before about Jantelagen, which is this, Scandinavian phrase that means basically don't think you're special and don't stand out. And there were really important reasons why that became embedded in the culture. And for those of us who, have, lived in this country for several generations, we still carry that, which to me is just sort of a testament to how much we carry the past with us and within us, and it's asking to be healed through us. So for me, when I step out, and I've, on the one hand, I feel like it could almost kill me because of those old imprints, even though, of course, it won't. But I'm healing the past forward. I'm not just repatterning something for myself, but it goes back and then it's carried forward into the future. And that feels like, it's important for us, I think, and that goes back to sort of what we said earlier on about friendship, which is, are we going to be willing to face, these things that are so difficult, that have such a huge payoff in terms of the growth that comes through relationship.
And I mean, and to me, that's the ultimate blessing here, right? And the blessing of really intimate relationships where we work past these fears, because what you're talking about, you feel like it's almost going to kill you opening up. Sometimes to me, it feels that way in a friendship, in our relationship, or in other relationships too. Really, it's like terrifying, though we long for it, to totally be seen. And I think that requires a forgiveness and a mercy on ourselves. Going back to David White's original quote, a mercy on each other, yes, but I sometimes think the harder thing is to be forgiving and have mercy on ourselves enough to show who we are imperfectly.
Well, I think, and women have a hard time cutting each other slack, and that goes back to like the grade school days. And I think it carries through. And I've been thinking, knowing this podcast was coming up, I've been thinking a lot about friendship, and I've been kind of tracking this theme I'm noticing between the people in my life who are interested in what I'm doing and invested in who I am through my actions, versus the people who are interested in my process. And I think, and that's been a big way that I've been sort of differentiating between what I feel like I'm growing into, which is sovereignty for me means we don't cling to any relationship, that we see the other person as their own whole person with their own family system and their own ancestors. So we don't become enmeshed in that way.
Right.
And then we get to stay sovereign. So if they do something that may be disappointing to us, it's not personal. But I find it fascinating that if somebody doesn't agree with like a choice or a deeply personal, direction that you're going in your life, that people, instead of saying, like, I hear a lot of this kind of thing, which is like, so you did this, huh?
And it feels very judgy, right?
It does. Or what's going on with this? And they only want to hear the upper story. They don't want to hear the story beneath the story, which is, what is that about for you? Because then that's where the intimacy is, right? It's really understanding somebody's process, because we would be surprised right and left if we could hear the story under the story, which is, I have no idea why you made this choice, and I may or may, it's not even my business to agree or disagree with your choice. That's when I get outside of my own medicine.
Totally.
When I start judging other people, then I know I'm out of my medicine. I start criticizing other people, I'm out of my medicine. But when I can become curious and say, wow, I am so curious about what went into that that decision for you? What was the process in it for you? What are you learning by doing that? That's really how to go deeper in any kind of relationship, whether it's a life partner, and I'm working on that with my children, my adult children, not so easy.
No, I am too,
right?
with my adult daughter, absolutely.
Right.
To not judge their choices.
Exactly.
And to give space for a different story to reveal for them. Because I definitely agree that judgment is such a barometer to me that I'm out of myself. It relates to control and fear, doesn't it? Thinking that we need to also get in there in control and fear. There's something about that judgment that is like, for me anyway, I don't think something's going to be okay. And here comes my codependency conditioning that I have to change it or fix it or pull way back from that person. Whereas like this loving titration is really, to me, and friendship, giving people the opportunity to have their own process. And I think you and I have practiced that with each other, doing that over time, right?
I think we really have, because you and I are quite different in the kinds of people we have, married, been in relationship with. The kinds of people that our other friends, right? Your friends and my friends, wouldn't necessarily be friends all the time.
It's interesting because our friends wouldn't, and yet we are, and yet our clients cross over. Like so many of our clients cross over, but not necessarily our personal friends. So,
right.
And just that thing that everybody represents a different part of us. And because we're different, there's nothing wrong at all. It means we have other friends and people in our lives that reflect different aspects of ourselves that we don't share with each other. But we have this incredible intersection that we do. And to me, accepting that no one person, including a partner, a lover, a husband, a spouse, and a close friend, is going to fill all of those needs. To me, that's been the liberation. And to get out of judgment thinking that somebody should, or that I should have a commentary on your process if it looks different from mine.
Mm-hmm. And again, like my wiring, all the stuff that's underneath that's informing that decision, it's coming from a completely different source in my ancestry than yours is. And even beneath that, there's something we all share in common. So there is also a lot of paradox in friendship, right? That we're part of a human family. And so sometimes we do feel like sisters, or we feel like, we've done this before, or we feel that we're walking something out that's really important in our lives or in the world. And it has those. And so it can feel that way. And also, you and I have had moments where we have recognized how like radically different our growing up years were.
Oh my gosh.
Right?
Like we talked about in the last podcast. Absolutely. So all of those things inform. I think it's interesting, though. I want to share the story with people who are listening that for 20 years, we have walked around wherever we've gone together, Santa Fe, being in San Diego, Dallas, we did shows down there. We did some professional events. People will ask us if we're sisters. And it's not that we physically look so much alike. If people see us, especially in person, we're about the same height, we're blonde, our faces really don't look alike. But there is something energetically that has been bigger than us, because people would ask me that about you even when we weren't together, or even if we were in like one of our two sort of splits in our relationship where we really were in kind of a break for each other. And to me, there's just something about that speaks to the mystery, though, of a kind of soul sister-like friendship, but that isn't about the projection, but is rather the deeper invitation we've had.
Yeah, and I think there's probably some kind of a resonance that builds between people over time, that it is like the third thing in a relationship. It is an energetic. And I'm sure that, you have that in different relationships in your life, right? Every significant relationship is going to alchemize and transform us in certain ways. And there's a third that comes out of it. Yeah, I think for you and I, the third has often been interpreted by other people as us being related. That's true. It's been really, especially in the last 5 years.
Yeah, it's kind of crazy sometimes.
Yeah, it happens very frequently. Yeah, I know. Yeah, so I'd love to share a little exercise about something I do with clients, and it's a practice I do for myself that supports what I consider to be relational sovereignty, which, for me, when I think about friendship in terms of relational sovereignty, I think of, someone who's going to hold with you in the mystery, and they don't have to make your life their life, right? But it's like we're interdependent, and yet we're walking out our own lives and working on this transformative process that's not always very conscious, toward this movement toward wholeness,
Yeah, and I think that can be the shadow of friendship, right? And I'm encouraging you to share this, but we've both experienced it with that enmeshment takes over, and then neither person is sovereign. And for a while, it can feel all sort of cozy, the way any addictive thing can feel, right? Kind of fun and cozy. And then it blows up, it backfires on us. It's not sustainable any more than that kind of enmeshment that sometimes happens in a new love. And there's an illusion to it, right? But what you're talking about, that sovereignty, and getting back to the original quote by David White, the mercy and forgiveness. And I think it's a spiritual practice to learn to be friends.
It's such a spiritual practice. And one constellation principle I'd like to share is that we don't have the right to take someone else's fate away from them. And I think sometimes in friendship we do that because we haven't been taught how to be with suffering, and we become so uncomfortable with a close friend who's having a hard time that instead of being able to get closer and to practice compassion with them and really hold space for them and be intimate and close, we end up pulling away because it's almost like we're afraid we're going to catch it, right? We don't know how to hold for someone else to have pain because it triggers our pain in ways that we haven't dealt with. So this exercise is one that you can do for friends, you can do for lovers and partners and spouses. You can do it for other family members even. Really works well for people you work with. But right now, let's think about it with a friend. So you basically imagine your friend standing in front of you, and you can do this as you close your eyes. And you imagine their parents behind them, regardless of what their relationship with their parents is. And then you imagine their grandparents behind them. And then you bring in the grandparents and you bring in all the ancestors. And then you can even invite in the energy of their homeland. Where did their ancestors come from? And you see that friend in front of you with their unique system. And then you realize that you have that same thing behind you. And you feel what it feels like to have your parents behind you, your grandparents and great-grandparents, in order, going all the way back to homeland, as far back as you want to go. And then you feel what it feels like to look at your friend with their lineage behind them and your lineage behind you. And it can change everything. And then you can, even without saying it out loud, but like as in a little meditation, you can say, I see you with your family, and I see you with your ancestors. And then you can imagine your friend saying it back to you. And something can be made right in that process where then we don't have to buy into the splits that happen in friendships. We get to just see our friend as a unique person who's connected to us in important ways. But they don't have to be us, and we don't have to save them. And anyway, that's been helpful for me.
Yeah, it's a beautiful process. It's a beautiful process. So, are we going to go on and now record our next podcast?
Yes, we are. Yes, we are.
Thank you for joining Camille and Tanya for this episode of Restorying the Culture. If you were inspired, we would deeply appreciate it if you would leave a review on iTunes or any other platform where you heard our podcast. For more ongoing inspiration and support, please join our no-cost global Facebook community, Restorying the Culture. You can support our podcast by making a donation here. And remember, we are each restoring the culture as we restory our own lives. See you next time.